The idea of the central finite curve does not announce itself loudly within the universe it shapes. It exists less as a wall and more as a quiet decision, a choice made long ago that continues to echo across realities without ever asking for permission again. When it is finally named, it feels almost incidental, as if the truth had always been there and simply waited for language to catch up. Yet its implications are anything but small. It is not merely a scientific construct or a clever piece of multiversal engineering. It is a statement about control, fear, and the boundaries intelligence places around itself when confronted with infinity. Before the curve, the multiverse is implied to be truly endless in every sense. Not just infinite in number, but infinite in hierarchy. Intelligence stretches upward and outward without a ceiling. There are universes where Rick is a minor mind, universes where he never invents interdimensional travel, universes where he is outpaced, outgrown, or rendered irrelevant by beings whose understanding dwarfs his own. This infinity is not comforting. It is hostile to identity. In such a multiverse, being exceptional means nothing, because exceptionality has no stable reference point. Someone is always smarter, always further ahead, always more capable of rewriting reality itself. The central finite curve changes that by narrowing infinity into something survivable. It does not remove infinite universes, instead, it filters them. Only realities in which Rick is the smartest being are allowed inside. The curve becomes a curated infinity, an enclosure built not to protect others, but to protect a particular idea of self. Within it, Rick can remain exceptional without having to confront what lies beyond that status. The multiverse becomes vast again, but safely so, shaped around a single recurring apex. What this changes first is not physics, but meaning. Intelligence within the curve becomes relative only to Rick. Genius is defined downward, never upward. Progress exists, but only within a ceiling that is never breached. The presence of this ceiling subtly alters every scientific breakthrough, every technological marvel, every civilization that rises and falls. No matter how advanced a society becomes, no matter how alien or powerful its inventions appear, they exist under an unspoken rule. None of it can surpass Rick. The multiverse inside the curve becomes a performance space where brilliance is allowed, even encouraged, as long as it never threatens the lead. This reshaping of meaning affects Rick as much as it affects everyone else. His identity becomes stabilized by design rather than by growth. Inside the curve, he no longer has to ask whether he is truly the smartest being alive. The answer has been engineered into reality itself. This produces a strange stillness at the core of his existence, while everything around him remains chaotic, destructive, and absurd. The one question that could destabilize him has been permanently removed. The curve does not make him smarter. It makes him safe. Safety, however, comes at a cost that is not immediately visible. By sealing off realities where Rick is not supreme, the curve also seals off genuine challenge. Threats still exist, but they are bounded threats, solvable threats, threats that ultimately reaffirm Rick's dominance even when they appear overwhelming. Failure becomes temporary. Death becomes reversible. Consequence becomes negotiable. The universe can hurt Rick, but it cannot surpass him. Over time, this erodes the meaning of risk itself. The Central Finite Curve also reshapes morality, though it never speaks in moral terms. By defining the multiverse around Rick's superiority, it implicitly assigns value based on intellectual rank. Lives within the curve become interchangeable iterations, endlessly replaceable, because their variations never exceed a certain depth. A universe can be destroyed, abandoned, or rewritten with little existential weight because there are countless near-identical versions waiting nearby. The curve turns infinito into redundancy. Individual worlds lose their uniqueness not because they are identical, but because their differences never matter enough to change the outcome. This redundancy feeds into Rick's detachment. Caring deeply about any one universe becomes irrational when it can be substituted without consequence. Emotional investment becomes inefficient. Attachment becomes a liability. The curve reinforces this worldview by ensuring that no universe will ever force Rick to confront loss that cannot be undone through intelligence. Even grief becomes something that can be routed around, avoided, or anesthetized through replacement. Yet the curve does not eliminate pain. It refines it. Suffering still exists, but it is internalized. Instead of being challenged by something greater than himself, Rick is trapped in a loop of his own limitations. He cannot be surpassed, but neither can he escape himself. Every version of him within the curve reflects the same core traits: brilliance, bitterness, avoidance, self-destruction disguised as freedom. The curve multiplies Rick endlessly, but never allows him to evolve past his defining patterns. In this way, the curve becomes a monument to stagnation disguised as dominance. It freezes Rick at the top of a hill that he built himself, cutting off the mountain ranges beyond. From within, the view is impressive, even intoxicating. From outside, it is small, a single peak surrounded by an immeasurable landscape that Rick will never see. The curve ensures that he never has to see it, never has to measure himself against something truly unknown. For everyone else inside the curve, the consequences are quieter, but no less profound. Entire civilizations exist solely as background noise to Rick's centrality. Their smartest minds may believe they are approaching cosmic understanding, unaware that their ceiling was installed before they ever began. Their struggles, triumphs, and extinctions play out in a universe that has already decided their maximum potential. They are not allowed to become gods, not because it is impossible, but because it would violate the terms of the enclosure. This introduces subtle tragedy. The curve does not just limit danger, it limits wonder. It removes the possibility of encountering something that cannot be understood, controlled, or reduced. Mystery becomes shallow. The unknown exists only temporarily, as a puzzle waiting for Rick's eventual solution. True otherness is excluded by design. The multiverse inside the curve becomes vast but familiar, endlessly surprising, yet never truly alien. What makes the Central Finite Curve especially unsettling is that it is not imposed by some external tyrant or cosmic authority. It is a self-imposed boundary. Rick does not cage the multiverse out of benevolence or duty. He does it because infinity, without hierarchy, terrifies him. The curve is a defense mechanism on a cosmological scale, a way to ensure that no being will ever make him feel small again. In doing so, Rick transforms the multiverse into an extension of his own psychology. The curve mirrors his refusal to confront vulnerability, his need to dominate rather than connect, his preference for control over growth. It is not just a scientific achievement, it is a coping strategy. The universe becomes shaped around avoidance rather than curiosity. This is why the curve matters so deeply to the structure of the story's universe. It explains why intelligence so rarely feels hopeful, why advancement often leads to emptiness rather than transcendence. Knowledge inside the curve is not a path forward. It is a reinforcement of the same cycle. The smartest man in the universe cannot move past his own shadow because he has ensured that no shadow can ever be larger than himself. The Central Finite Curve changes the multiverse by making it manageable, but it also changes Rick by making him permanent. As long as the curve exists, he does not need to grow. He does not need to face the possibility that he is not enough. The cost of that safety is paid by every universe trapped inside it, endlessly orbiting a fixed center that never allows itself to be questioned. This is only the beginning of what the curve alters. Its true impact unfolds slowly, not in explosions or declarations, but in the quiet erosion of possibility. To understand what it ultimately takes away, it is first necessary to understand why it was built at all. The Central Finite Curve does not end with its construction. It begins there. Once the boundary exists, its presence reshapes behavior, expectation, and history retroactively, as though the multiverse inside it had always been meant to function this way. What appears on the surface to be a simple filter becomes a gravitational force on narrative itself. Every story told within the curve bends toward the same conclusion. Rick remains central, and nothing fundamentally replaces him. Inside the curve, intelligence becomes performative. Innovation no longer points toward transcendence, but toward utility. Scientific discovery is valued not for what it reveals about existence, but for how efficiently it solves immediate problems or asserts dominance. This subtly changes the trajectory of civilizations. Societies that might have pursued philosophical or metaphysical expansion instead turn inward or sideways, refining tools, weapons, and comforts within known limits. The dream of becoming something entirely new fades before it can be articulated, because the universe itself resists that direction. This resistance is not experienced as oppression. Most beings inside the curve never sense it at all. They feel free, advanced, even godlike within their own contexts. The tragedy is invisible because it is structural rather than violent. The curve does not crush ambition, it redirects it. Aspirations bend toward achievable peaks rather than unreachable horizons. Progress continues, but it loops rather than ascends. Rick thrives in this environment precisely because it aligns with his emotional architecture. His cynicism, his belief that meaning is an illusion and attachment is weakness, is constantly validated by a multiverse that never contradicts him. Every time he outsmarts a god, dismantles an empire, or escapes a cosmic threat, the curve quietly reinforces the idea that intelligence is the only real currency and that he holds the highest denomination. The universe keeps agreeing with him over and over again. This agreement is corrosive. When nothing can truly challenge you, even victory loses its texture. Triumph becomes expected, and expectation drains it of satisfaction. Rick's recklessness escalates not because he enjoys danger, but because ordinary danger no longer registers. He must push further, break more rules, and inflict greater damage just to feel the echo of stakes. The curve turns thrill into addiction and brilliance into boredom. Mortality inside the curve becomes especially distorted. Death is frequent but rarely final. Versions of people can be replaced, timelines reset, outcomes revised. This does not eliminate grief, but it fragments it. Loss becomes abstract, something that happens often but never fully lands. Emotional pain lingers, but without resolution. The curve allows suffering to exist while denying it closure, trapping characters in a state of perpetual emotional suspension. This is most evident in Rick's relationship to family. The presence of infinite versions of loved ones makes intimacy simultaneously possible and impossible. Connection is always available, but never irreplaceable. This creates a paradox where Rick seeks companionship while undermining it, drawn to closeness yet unable to treat it as singular. The curve enables this contradiction by ensuring that no relationship can ever become cosmically necessary. There is always another version nearby, waiting as a contingency plan. The multiverse outside the curve, though rarely seen, haunts this dynamic by implication. It represents not just greater intelligence, but genuine unpredictability. Beyond the curve exist beings and realities that cannot be reduced to Rick's frameworks. They are not merely smarter, they are different in ways that refuse translation. By cutting himself off from them, Rick avoids the kind of encounter that would force transformation rather than adaptation. Transformation is what the curve forbids most effectively. Inside it, Rick can change circumstances endlessly without changing himself. He can become richer, lonelier, more violent, more detached, but never fundamentally different. The curve locks him into a version of himself that is endlessly replicated across realities. Each Rick believes himself unique, yet all orbit the same emotional center. The multiverse becomes a hall of mirrors, reflecting the same unresolved core. This repetition extends to conflict. Enemies rise, fall, and rise again in altered forms, but none truly escape the gravitational pull of Rick's superiority. Even rebellions against him tend to mirror his own traits. Intelligence weaponized, detachment elevated to ideology, cruelty justified through logic. The curve ensures that opposition never introduces a new value system powerful enough to displace Rick's own. Resistance becomes imitation. From a broader perspective, the curve reshapes what it means to be a universe at all. Universes inside it are no longer autonomous systems with their own ultimate potential. They are components of a larger mechanism designed to preserve a single constant. Their histories matter only insofar as they interact with that constant. This quietly undermines the idea of cosmic equality. Some realities matter more, not because they are richer or kinder, but because they are closer to Rick's orbit. This creates an ethical vacuum. When one mind becomes the reference point for all others, morality loses its anchor. Right and wrong become situational, defined by convenience and survival rather than principle. The curve does not impose nihilism, but it makes nihilism efficient. Caring deeply about justice, suffering, or future generations becomes irrational when outcomes can always be recalculated or escaped. The smartest move is detachment, and the curve rewards smart moves above all else. What makes this especially unsettling is how normal it all feels from the inside. The curve does not announce itself daily. It does not need to. Its influence is ambient, shaping expectations so thoroughly that alternatives stop occurring to those within it. The idea that the universe could be organized differently becomes abstract, almost childish. This is how control operates at its most effective level, not through force, but through normalization. Even the act of rebellion against the curve is difficult to conceptualize while living inside it. To reject the curve is to accept the possibility of being surpassed, outgrown, or rendered irrelevant. It requires a willingness to face insignificance, not as a joke or a threat, but as a genuine condition of existence. For Rick, whose identity is built around being the smartest, this is an existential cliff rather than a philosophical exercise. The curve, therefore, represents not just a boundary between universes, but a boundary between two modes of being. On one side lies controlled infinity, where meaning is flattened and hierarchy is enforced. On the other lies uncontrolled infinity, where intelligence may fail, identity may dissolve, and certainty may not survive. The curve chooses safety over truth, dominance over discovery. As long as it remains intact, everything inside it participates in that choice, whether knowingly or not. The multiverse becomes a closed ecosystem of brilliance without humility, power without growth, freedom without risk. It is an impressive construction, elegant in its cruelty, quiet in its consequences, and yet cracks begin to form not from external pressure, but from internal exhaustion. A system built to prevent surprise eventually grows fragile to it. When something finally does not fit, when an outcome refuses to loop back into expectation, the curve's greatest weakness is exposed. It has no answer for change that does not originate from Rick himself. That vulnerability does not announce itself loudly either. It begins as discomfort, as irritation, as a sense that something is wrong, despite every equation balancing. The curve was never meant to be questioned by those inside it. But the longer it exists, the more its silence becomes noticeable. The discomfort that grows within the Central Finite Curve is subtle, almost polite. It does not erupt as rebellion or catastrophe at first. It manifests as repetition becoming visible. Patterns once mistaken for chaos start to feel rehearsed. The same kinds of crises recur with minor variations. The same emotional stalemates reset after moments of apparent progress. What once felt like infinite possibility begins to resemble a loop disguised as freedom. For Rick, this sensation is particularly corrosive because it cannot be solved through intellect alone. The curve was designed to eliminate existential threats, not existential boredom. Its success in doing the former makes the latter unavoidable. When every universe operates under the same invisible rule, surprise becomes cosmetic. Even novelty begins to feel pre-approved, as though reality itself is playing within a sandbox whose boundaries can never be crossed. This is where the curve's greatest illusion begins to fail. It promises infinity, but delivers scale instead. There are endless places to go, but nowhere fundamentally new to arrive. The difference matters. Infinity implies transformation, the possibility of encountering something that rewrites your understanding of yourself. Scale simply multiplies experience without deepening it. The curve offers scale in abundance, and Rick exploits it relentlessly, but the hunger underneath remains untouched. That hunger is not for power, despite appearances. It is for meaning that does not collapse under scrutiny. Rick's intelligence allows him to dismantle illusions faster than they can stabilize. But the curve ensures that no replacement illusion ever challenges him deeply enough to matter. Each revelation feels hollow because it leads back to the same conclusion. He is still on top, still alone, still correct in his cynicism. The universe keeps proving him right, and being right becomes unbearable. Inside the curve, even failure is constrained. Rick can lose battles, be humiliated, even die. But these failures are temporary states rather than defining events. They do not reframe his identity. They merely interrupt it. True failure, the kind that forces reinvention, requires a context where success is not guaranteed. The curve removes that context entirely. It is a safety net stretched so wide that it becomes the ground itself. Other beings inside the curve begin to reflect this stagnation in quieter ways. Ambitious figures rise, believing they are reshaping existence, only to plateau at a point they cannot articulate. Their myths of progress lose momentum. Religions that promise transcendence grow vague, turning inward or collapsing into ritual. Art becomes increasingly ironic, self-referential, or nihilistic, mirroring a universe that senses its own limits without understanding why. This cultural flattening is not caused by Rick's direct interference, but by his inevitability. When a single intelligence defines the maximum outcome of reality, all narratives subconsciously orient around that fact. Even rebellion becomes aesthetic rather than transformative. Characters rage against systems they cannot name, sensing an absence rather than an enemy. The curve functions like gravity, invisible, constant, shaping everything without needing enforcement. Rick's awareness of this gravity fluctuates. Sometimes he feels it as irritation, sometimes as despair, sometimes as rage disguised as humor. His self-destructive tendencies escalate not because he wants to die, but because he wants to feel something irreversible. He pushes relationships to breaking points, engineers catastrophes, and abandons worlds mid-crisis, all in an attempt to produce consequences that cannot be undone by intelligence alone. Yet the curve absorbs even this. Damage spreads, but it never reaches a critical mass that threatens the structure itself. Rick can ruin lives, planets, even universes, and the system adjusts. There is always another version, another timeline, another workaround. The multiverse inside the curve is resilient precisely because it was designed around a single variable. As long as Rick exists as he is, the system holds. This is where the curve's cruelty becomes clearest. It traps Rick in the very role he believes protects him. By ensuring that he is always the smartest, it ensures that he is always responsible. There is no one to defer to, no authority to challenge, no external standard to appeal to. Every disaster ultimately loops back to him, either through causation or neglect. The curve makes Rick omnipotent in practice, and omnipotence becomes isolation. Isolation, in turn, distorts time. Without the possibility of permanent change, moments blur together. Rick experiences eras as episodes rather than chapters, events as experiments rather than milestones. Life loses its narrative arc. There is no sense of building towards something, only of moving it out through endless variations of the same emotional terrain. The curve removes the future as a meaningful concept. What lies beyond the curve gains power precisely because it is absent. The idea of universes where Rick is not central becomes a kind of negative space, a haunting implication rather than a location. These unseen realities represent not just stronger beings, but alternative values. They suggest that intelligence might not be the highest axis of existence, that meaning could arise from collaboration, humility, or forms of perception Rick has never cultivated. The curve suppresses these possibilities not through censorship, but through irrelevance. They simply do not appear. And because they do not appear, Rick does not have to reject them. He can continue believing that nothing worth encountering exists beyond his reach. The system protects his worldview by ensuring it is never tested. But worldviews decay when untested. Certainty hardens into dogma, and dogma into fatigue. The curve's greatest weakness is not external threat, but internal erosion. Over time, even Rick's confidence begins to feel rehearsed. His contempt for meaning starts to ring hollow to himself. The jokes lose their edge. The rage becomes habitual rather than reactive. This is the stage at which the curve stops functioning as a triumph of control and begins functioning as a prison. Not a prison enforced by guards or walls, but one enforced by predictability. Everything inside behaves exactly as it should, and that becomes intolerable. The absence of the unknown turns existence into maintenance rather than exploration. The Central Finite Curve was built to remove fear, but fear was never the real enemy. The unknown was. By eliminating it, Rick eliminated the possibility of being changed by something other than his own decisions. The universe became an echo chamber scaled to infinity. What happens next cannot be solved by greater intelligence or more elaborate engineering. The curve has already optimized those paths to exhaustion. Any real shift would require accepting vulnerability at a level Rick has spent his entire existence avoiding. It would require stepping into a reality where being the smartest no longer guarantees survival, relevance, or control. The curve resists this, not because it is sentient, but because it was designed to. It bends events away from that outcome whenever possible, and yet resistance is not the same as impossibility. The longer the system persists, the more its rigidity becomes a liability. Change, when it finally comes, will not arrive as an invasion or a war. It will arrive as a choice. The choice that begins to form does not present itself as heroic or dramatic. It arrives quietly, almost disguised as exhaustion. When a system has been optimized to eliminate uncertainty, the first sign of failure is not chaos, but numbness. Rick does not wake up one day deciding that the central finite curve must be undone. He reaches a point where maintaining it feels heavier than the risk of losing it. The curve has always required upkeep, not just technologically, but psychologically. It depends on Rick continuing to believe in the premise that intelligence should sit at the center of existence. As long as that belief holds, the curve feels justified. But belief erodes when it stops delivering relief. The curve was meant to shield Rick from insignificance. Yet over time, it delivers a different form of insignificance. The sense that nothing he does actually matters, because the outcome is always the same. Within the curve, even acts of apparent growth are suspect. Rick can apologize, reconnect, sacrifice, or retreat, but these moments exist in a universe that cannot hold them permanently. They feel provisional, easily undone by the next crisis or the next version of events. The curve robs redemption of permanence. Change becomes something that happens temporarily, never something that sticks. This is why the curve ultimately undermines Rick's intelligence rather than affirming it. Intelligence thrives on uncertainty, on encountering problems that cannot be solved with existing frameworks. Inside the curve, every problem already assumes Rick's eventual dominance. The unknown is not truly unknown. It is merely delayed understanding. This turns intelligence into maintenance rather than discovery, optimization rather than exploration. As Rick senses this, his relationship with control begins to fracture. Control no longer feels empowering. It feels repetitive. The curve, once a symbol of mastery, becomes a reminder of self-imposed limits. Every time Rick asserts dominance, he reinforces the very structure that prevents him from encountering anything new. Victory starts to feel like compliance. The idea of stepping outside the curve is terrifying, not because of the dangers beyond it, but because of what it would mean to no longer be central. Outside the curve, Rick would not be guaranteed relevance. He could be outmatched, ignored, or rendered obsolete. His intelligence might fail. His assumptions might collapse. He would no longer be able to define the terms of existence. This is precisely why the possibility begins to matter. Meaning, unlike control, cannot be engineered into existence. It emerges from friction, from limitation, from confronting something that does not bend. The curve removes that friction. By sealing off realities where Rick is not supreme, it seals off the conditions under which meaning could re-enter his life. The curve also distorts responsibility in a subtle way. Inside it, Rick is responsible for everything and nothing at the same time. He can fix nearly any problem, which means failure feels like negligence rather than limitation. At the same time, the infinite replaceability of worlds means that fixing any one problem feels optional. This contradiction breeds apathy. When responsibility becomes infinite, it becomes abstract. Breaking the curve would reintroduce finitude. Choices would matter again, because they could not be undone. Failure would carry weight because it might not be survivable. Intelligence would no longer be a shield, but a tool, one that could be insufficient. This is not appealing to Rick's ego, but it is appealing to something deeper that the curve has starved: the need for reality to push back. The curve has always been asymmetric. Rick controls it, but it also controls him. The more thoroughly it succeeds, the more predictable his existence becomes. Predictability is not safety, it is erosion. Over time, Rick begins to sense that the curve is not preserving his freedom, but consuming it. Freedom without uncertainty is just range, not choice. Other beings inside the curve feel echoes of this erosion without understanding its source. They experience stagnation, despair, or restlessness that cannot be explained by material conditions. Their civilizations reach plateaus that feel arbitrary. Their philosophies circle the same questions without resolution. The curve acts as a ceiling on existential depth, flattening experience across realities. What makes the eventual breaking of the curve so significant is not the chaos it unleashes, but the humility it demands. To dismantle it is to admit that intelligence alone is not enough to sustain meaning. It is to accept that being the smartest does not guarantee fulfillment and may actively prevent it. This admission is more difficult than any technological challenge Rick has faced. The curve's collapse, and when it comes, is not a failure of science, but a failure of avoidance. It marks the end of a strategy that prioritized safety over growth. It opens the multiverse not just to greater threats, but to genuine difference. For the first time, Rick is no longer protected from being changed by what he encounters. This does not make him weaker in any simple sense. It makes him unfinished. Outside the curve, intelligence becomes one trait among many, rather than the organizing principle of reality. Power becomes contextual. Survival becomes uncertain. Identity becomes something that must be negotiated rather than enforced. The Central Finite Curve changed the multiverse by turning infinity into a controlled environment. Its undoing changes the multiverse again by restoring risk. It does not promise hope or improvement. It promises only honesty. The universe no longer agrees to be shaped around a single mind. For Rick, this is both loss and possibility. He is no longer guaranteed to matter. And for the first time in a very long time, that uncertainty feels real enough to care about. When the curve loosens its hold, the immediate sensation is not freedom, but exposure. The universe no longer feels calibrated to accommodate Rick's presence. Events stop resolving themselves neatly. Problems emerge that do not politely wait for solutions. Outcomes become uneven, sometimes unfair, sometimes unresolved. The world resumes behaving as though intelligence were merely one force among many, rather than the governing principle. This shift is deeply unsettling because it strips away a layer of narrative protection Rick has relied on for most of his existence. Inside the curve, reality behaves like a story written with him in mind. Outside it, reality stops caring who he is. The universe does not antagonize him, it simply proceeds. This indifference is more threatening than hostility ever was. The first real consequence of this change is that intelligence regains its original risk. Knowledge can fail. Calculations can be incomplete. Preparation can be insufficient. For someone who has built an identity on never being outmatched, this introduces a new emotional texture, uncertainty that cannot be laughed off or brute forced into submission. Rick is no longer guaranteed the luxury of detachment. Detachment had always been his primary defense. The curve allowed him to treat everything as temporary, reversible, or replaceable. Without it, permanence creeps back in. Decisions linger. Mistakes accumulate. Damage does not always reset. This does not immediately produce wisdom or empathy, but it creates the conditions under which they could exist. For the first time, actions carry weight that intelligence alone cannot neutralize. The multiverse itself becomes more uneven. Some realities are harsher, others stranger, others incomprehensible, in ways that defy Rick's usual analytical shortcuts. There are intelligences that do not present themselves as rivals, but as systems so different they cannot be meaningfully compared. Rick is forced to confront the possibility that intelligence is not a universal metric, that being smartest may be an irrelevant concept in some contexts. This realization destabilizes the hierarchy that defined his universe. Inside the curve, intelligence sat at the top, organizing all other traits beneath it. Outside, hierarchies fracture. Power takes unfamiliar forms. Influence arises from cooperation, scale, or qualities Rick has long dismissed as sentimental or inefficient. The universe becomes less legible, and legibility had always been his advantage. With this loss of legibility comes a strange relief. The pressure to dominate every situation diminishes when dominance is no longer assured. Rick no longer has to be right all the time, because being right no longer guarantees survival or control. Failure becomes a shared condition rather than a personal insult. This does not make him kinder overnight, but it softens the rigidity that defined his relationship with existence. The absence of the curve also changes how time is experienced. Without the guarantee of replacement, moments regain singularity. People are no longer interchangeable variables. Worlds cannot be abandoned without consequence. This reintroduces grief in its full form, not as a temporary inconvenience, but as something that must be carried. Pain becomes heavier, but also more meaningful. Meaning itself re-enters the universe quietly. It does not arrive as a revelation or a cosmic truth. It emerges through limitation. When not everything can be saved, what is saved matters more. When not every mistake can be corrected, choices demand care. The curve's removal does not impose purpose, but it removes the barriers that made purpose impossible. Rick's relationship with his own intelligence begins to change under these conditions. It stops being an identity and becomes a tool again. A powerful tool, but one that must coexist with uncertainty, emotion, and chance. Intelligence becomes something he uses rather than something he is. This distinction is subtle, but transformative. It opens the possibility of growth that is not measured by superiority. The broader multiverse responds unevenly to this new openness. Some realities collapse under the weight of unpredictability. Others flourish in unexpected ways. The absence of a central organizing intelligence allows diversity to reassert itself. There is no longer a single narrative gravity pulling everything into alignment. Stories diverge, sometimes incoherently, sometimes beautifully. What the Central Finite Curve truly changed, in the end, was not the structure of the multiverse, but the conditions under which meaning could exist. By enforcing safety and hierarchy, It removed the risk that gives actions significance. Its undoing does not guarantee fulfillment or redemption. It guarantees only that outcomes are no longer pre-negotiated. For Rick, this is the hardest truth to accept. The universe is no longer designed to affirm him, protect him, or orbit him. He must now participate rather than dominate, adapt rather than control. This does not make him ordinary, but it makes him vulnerable in a way he has never allowed himself to be. The curve was built to answer a question Rick could not tolerate asking. What if he is not enough? Its removal does not answer that question either. It simply makes it unavoidable. And in that uncertainty, for the first time, existence stops feeling like a solved problem and starts feeling like something that must be lived. What follows the loss of certainty is not clarity, but friction. Without the curve quietly smoothing the edges of reality, contradictions begin to matter again. Rick can no longer assume coherence. The universe stops behaving like a system that ultimately converges on his understanding. Instead, it fragments into overlapping logics that do not resolve into a single framework. Some things cannot be optimized. Some outcomes cannot be improved. Some failures cannot be rationalized away. This friction introduces a new kind of exhaustion. It is not the boredom of repetition, but the fatigue of engagement. Every situation now demands attention rather than calculation. Rick cannot simply outthink reality. He must negotiate with it. This requires patience, humility, and restraint, traits he has long considered inefficient. Intelligence alone no longer guarantees asylum, and escape itself is no longer always desirable. The absence of the curve also removes a certain kind of emotional anesthesia. Inside it, pain could be contextualized as temporary or local, something that could be rerouted through a different timeline or diluted across versions. Outside it, pain reclaims its density. Loss does not disperse across infinite alternatives. It concentrates. Grief becomes something that persists rather than something that can be deferred. This persistence forces memory to change its role. Memories inside the curve were optional, selectively revisited or overwritten by new experiences. Without it, memory regains authority. The past cannot be dismissed as a bad iteration or an avoidable branch. It becomes part of a continuous self rather than a collection of interchangeable states. Identity begins to stabilize not through dominance, but through accumulation. That accumulation is uncomfortable. Rick has always preferred motion to reflection, action to reckoning. The curve enabled this preference by ensuring that no moment ever demanded full accountability. With that protection gone, reflection becomes unavoidable. Patterns that were once masked by scale now appear clearly. Repetition is no longer evidence of control, but of avoidance. Other beings in the multiverse experience parallel shifts. Some respond with fear, attempting to recreate localized versions of the curve, smaller enclosures built around ideology, technology, or authority. These attempts reveal how seductive control can be when uncertainty returns. Others move in the opposite direction, embracing instability as a condition rather than a problem. Entire cultures begin to experiment with forms of existence that would have been inefficient or irrational inside the curve. This diversity is chaotic, uneven, and often destructive, but it is no longer filtered. The universe stops curating outcomes. There is no longer a guarantee that the smartest solution will prevail, or that intelligence will even be relevant. In some realities, survival depends on cooperation, resilience, or adaptability, rather than brilliance. In others, meaning emerges from constraints Rick would once have dismissed as arbitrary. Rick's discomfort with this shift is not rooted in fear of death, but in fear of irrelevance. The curve ensured that he always mattered, even when he claimed not to care. Without it, his importance becomes situational rather than absolute. He matters where he contributes, not because of who he is. This conditional relevance is destabilizing, but it is also honest. Honesty, in this context, is not comforting. It strips away the irony and detachment Rick used as armor. Jokes land differently when they cannot neutralize consequences. Sarcasm loses its edge when it no longer implies superiority. Emotional distance becomes harder to maintain when outcomes are no longer reversible. Rick finds himself exposed not because others overpower him, but because reality stops accommodating his defenses. The curve's removal also changes the meaning of failure. Inside it, failure was instructional at best, cosmetic at worst. Outside it, failure can end stories rather than redirect them. This reintroduces tragedy as a genuine possibility rather than a narrative flourish. Not everything breaks in a way that teaches a lesson. Some things simply break. This is where Rick's intelligence faces its most difficult test. Not whether it can solve problems, but whether it can coexist with unsolved ones. The curve trained him to expect resolution. Its absence demands tolerance for ambiguity. Questions remain open. Conflicts persist. Meaning is provisional rather than final. For someone accustomed to answers, this is disorienting. Yet within that disorientation lies a fragile opportunity. When the universe stops guaranteeing validation, curiosity can reemerge without being immediately instrumentalized. Rick no longer needs to understand something in order to dominate it. He can encounter phenomena that resist explanation without immediately trying to dismantle them. Wonder long suppressed by cynicism becomes possible again, though it is tentative and easily disrupted. The multiverse itself becomes less narratively efficient. Stories no longer center around a single axis. Some arcs fade without resolution. Others conclude without significance. This lack of narrative coherence mirrors lived experience more closely than the engineered elegance of the curve ever did. Existence becomes messier, but also more authentic. What the curve had truly removed was not danger but scale of consequence. By flattening infinity into a controlled system, it reduced every action to a manageable variable. Its absence restores disproportion. Small choices can have vast effects. Minor mistakes can cascade. This makes caution meaningful again, not as a strategy, but as an ethic. Rick's gradual confrontation with this reality does not lead to enlightenment or redemption. It leads to adjustment. He must recalibrate what intelligence is for. No longer the foundation of identity, it becomes a means of participation. He is no longer the axis around which outcomes rotate, but one agent among many. Sometimes influential, sometimes irrelevant. This shift does not erase his flaws. It exposes them. Control, once justified by necessity, now appears as habit. Detachment, once efficient, now reads as avoidance. The curve allowed these traits to function without consequence. Without it, they begin to cost him something tangible. The most profound change is subtle. The universe no longer needs to be impressed. Inside the curve, brilliance was performative, constantly reaffirmed through dominance. Outside it, brilliance can be quiet, contextual, even unnoticed. Rick can solve a problem without the solution redefining reality. He can help without becoming central. This possibility unsettles him more than any threat ever did. The Central Finite Curve changed existence by making intelligence the organizing principle of reality. Its absence reveals intelligence as one force among many, powerful but insufficient. This does not diminish Rick's capability, it reframes it. He is no longer protected from insignificance, but neither is he condemned to it. Significance must now be earned through engagement rather than enforced through structure. This is not a happy ending. It is not even a stable one. It is a return to uncertainty, to uneven outcomes, to a universe that does not promise coherence. But in that uncertainty, something the curve could never allow begins to take shape. The possibility that meaning is not something you build walls around, but something that emerges when you stop doing so. The long-term consequence of leaving the curve behind is not revelation, but recalibration. The universe does not replace one organizing principle with another. It simply refuses to organize itself around any single one again. What remains is a field of competing values, overlapping intelligences, incompatible goals, and outcomes that resist being unified into a clean explanation. This is the condition that the Central Finite Curve was designed to prevent, not because it was dangerous in a physical sense, but because it was destabilizing in an existential one. Within the narrative logic of Rick and Morty, the curve once functioned as a hidden rule that kept chaos entertaining rather than overwhelming. Without it, chaos becomes less legible. There is no longer an assurance that events will orbit a familiar emotional center. The universe begins to feel wider in a way that is not flattering, expansive without being accommodating. Rick's struggle in this environment is not primarily external. He is still capable, still dangerous, still far more intelligent than most beings he encounters. What has changed is the reliability of context. His intelligence no longer guarantees narrative relevance. He can solve problems that lead nowhere, prevent disasters that no one notices, or fail in ways that cannot be reframed as learning experiences. The universe no longer collaborates in making his actions feel significant. This shift produces a new kind of silence. Inside the curve, even destruction carried a kind of noise. There were reactions, resets, replacements, confirmations of impact. Outside it, some actions simply disappear into the background of a much larger reality. Rick is forced to confront a truth the curve carefully concealed. Significance is not proportional to effort or brilliance. It is situational, fragile, and often temporary. This fragility alters how relationships function. When outcomes are no longer reversible, proximity matters more. Distance becomes riskier. Walking away is no longer a neutral act, because absence can become permanent. Rick can no longer rely on the existence of alternatives to excuse neglect. The presence of others gains weight, not because they are irreplaceable in theory, but because replacement no longer carries the same emotional or existential equivalence. The curve once allowed Rick to treat connection as optional, something he could engage with or abandon depending on convenience. Outside it, connection becomes a commitment rather than an experiment. This does not make him suddenly affectionate or open. It makes avoidance costly. Emotional detachment begins to register consequences that intelligence cannot smooth over. The multiverse mirrors this change unevenly. Some regions collapse under the strain of unpredictability, unable to adapt to a reality that no longer enforces ceilings. Others evolve in directions that would have been impossible under the curve's hierarchy. New forms of cooperation emerge, not because they are optimal, but because they are necessary. Intelligence becomes distributed rather than centralized, contextual rather than absolute. This distribution undermines the myth of the singular genius. Inside the curve, progress often hinged on one mind imposing order. Outside it, progress becomes collaborative, messy, and slower. Breakthroughs occur not through domination, but through synthesis. For Rick, this is deeply frustrating. Collaboration requires compromise, patience, and trust in other forms of reasoning. It also requires acknowledging limits. Limits are what the curve was built to erase. By ensuring Rick was always the smartest, it removed the need to accept constraint. Without it, constraint returns as a defining feature of existence. Time, resources, attention, and emotional energy become finite again. Choices matter not because they are optimal, but because they exclude alternatives. This exclusion reintroduces regret as a real force. Inside the curve, regret could always be neutralized by revision. Outside it, regret accumulates. Not every path can be revisited. Not every mistake can be undone. This does not lead to moral clarity, but it does lead to moral weight. Actions become harder to dismiss when their consequences linger. The curve's absence also exposes how much of Rick's nihilism was conditional. It thrived in an environment where nothing was permanent and everything was replaceable. When permanence returns, nihilism loses its efficiency. Dismissing meaning becomes less convincing when meaning asserts itself through loss, limitation, and consequence. The universe no longer supports the idea that nothing matters. It simply refuses to explain what does. This refusal forces a shift in how Rick relates to knowledge itself. Inside the curve, knowledge functioned as control. Outside it, knowledge becomes navigation. It helps him move through uncertainty rather than eliminate it. This is a quieter, less triumphant role for intelligence. It does not guarantee safety or dominance. It offers orientation, not authority. The most unsettling aspect of this change is that it cannot be reversed without cost. Rebuilding the curve would require recommitting to the same fear that created it. The fear of being surpassed, replaced, or rendered irrelevant. Having experienced a universe that does not revolve around him, Rick can no longer pretend that control is synonymous with freedom. The illusion has broken. Yet this does not mean Rick finds peace in uncertainty. He remains restless, resistant, often cruel. The difference is that these traits now exist in a universe that does not bend around them. His flaws are no longer buffered by structure. They create friction rather than spectacle. This friction is uncomfortable, but it is also grounding. The Central Finite Curve changed reality by enforcing hierarchy and safety at a cosmic scale. Its removal does not install a better system. It removes the guarantee that systems will exist at all. What remains is contingency. Outcomes that depend on context, cooperation, chance, and restraint as much as intelligence. This contingency is the final challenge Rick must face. Not whether he can dominate reality, but whether he can live in one that does not promise him a central role. The curve protected him from that question by ensuring the answer was always yes. Without it, the answer becomes variable, and variability is something no equation can eliminate. As the multiverse continues, without a single organizing mind, one truth becomes unavoidable. Intelligence can shape reality, but it cannot replace participation. Control can prevent loss, but it cannot generate meaning. The curve solved the problem of being outmatched by eliminating the conditions under which growth occurs. What remains now is unfinished. Not a conclusion, not a redemption, not a triumph. Just a universe that no longer agrees to be managed from the center, and a mind that must decide whether it will continue trying to build walls or learn how to exist without them. What remains after all structures fall away is not chaos in the dramatic sense, but openness without instruction. The universe does not rush to fill the space the curve once occupied. There is no new framework waiting underneath. No hidden hierarchy ready to assert itself. The absence simply persists. Reality continues, uneven and indifferent, allowing events to unfold without guaranteeing interpretation. This is the condition Rick has avoided his entire existence. Not danger, not death, not even failure, but a world that does not explain itself in relation to him. The curve ensured that even meaninglessness was meaningful because it could always be traced back to his intelligence, his choices, his dominance. Without it, meaning becomes decentralized. It does not point inward toward a single mind. It emerges locally, temporarily, often without recognition. Rick's final confrontation with this reality is not a moment of realization, but a slow adjustment in how he moves through existence. He begins to encounter situations that do not respond to mastery, not because they are stronger, but because they are irrelevant to competition. Some problems cannot be solved because they are not problems in the first place. Some beings do not want answers. Some systems do not improve when optimized. This forces Rick into a posture he has never trusted: participation without authority. He can contribute, influence, assist, or withdraw, but none of these actions define the universe around them. He is present rather than central. This presence is fragile. It can be rejected, ignored, or rendered obsolete. For someone who once shaped infinity to avoid this condition, the exposure is profound. Yet this exposure also carries a strange quietness. Without the need to dominate every scenario, Rick's intelligence no longer has to perform constantly. There is no requirement to prove supremacy, no obligation to dismantle every structure he encounters. Some things can be left intact. Some mysteries can remain unresolved. The pressure to reduce everything to solvable components begins to ease, not because Rick has learned humility, but because reality no longer rewards excess control. Time begins to feel different under these conditions. Without constant resets and substitutions, duration regains weight. Waiting matters, aging matters, absence matters. Rick experiences stretches of existence that are not punctuated by crisis or spectacle, but by continuity. These stretches are uncomfortable at first, filled with restlessness and irritation, but they also allow something unfamiliar to emerge: endurance. Endurance is not triumph. It is not intelligence asserting itself. It is simply staying present without rewriting the terms of engagement. The curve made endurance unnecessary. Everything could be escaped, replaced, or outmaneuvered. Without it, endurance becomes a skill rather than a concession. Rick is not good at it, but he can no longer avoid practicing it. The universe, now unconstrained, does not reward this effort with clarity. There is no moment where uncertainty resolves into purpose. Instead, patterns begin to form slowly, not at the scale of multiversal dominance, but at the scale of lived experience. Small consistencies appear. Actions begin to echo in limited but tangible ways. Choices start to accumulate rather than disperse. These accumulations are imperfect. They include regret, damage, missed opportunities, and unfinished attempts at connection. But they also include continuity, shared memory, and consequences that do not vanish when ignored. The curve eliminated accumulation because accumulation implies limitation. Without it, limitation returns as the medium through which meaning becomes possible. Rick does not suddenly believe in purpose. He does not adopt a new philosophy to replace the one that failed him. What changes is subtler. He stops needing the universe to confirm his conclusions. He stops demanding that reality justify itself through intellect alone. This does not make him content. It makes him quieter. Quiet, for Rick, is unfamiliar territory. It lacks the noise of dominance, the feedback loop of superiority, the constant friction that once defined his presence. In that quiet, emotions that were once background interference begin to surface without being immediately analyzed away. Not in neat arcs, not in lessons, but in fragments that resist categorization. The curve prevented this by turning experience into data. Outside it, experience remains effurience. It does not always teach. It does not always resolve. It simply persists. Rick can no longer metabolize everything into insight or irony. Some things linger unresolved, and intelligence does not automatically grant immunity to that discomfort. This is where the true change occurs. Not in the structure of the multiverse, but in the relationship between mind and reality. The curve positioned intelligence as the organizing force of existence. Its absence reveals intelligence as responsive rather than sovereign, powerful but not sufficient, transformative but not definitive. Rick remains who he is. He does not become gentle. He does not become wise in any traditional sense. What he becomes is exposed to contingency. His actions now exist in a world that does not promise forgiveness, repetition, or correction. This does not redeem him. It contextualizes him. The central finite curve once turned infinity into a mirror, endlessly reflecting the same dominant form. Its removal allows infinity to fracture again, not into chaos, but into difference. Some differences will be hostile, Others will be incomprehensible. Many will be indifferent. The universe does not coordinate them into a lesson. And that is the final change the curve imposed and then relinquished. It removed the obligation for existence to make sense under a single framework. It stopped requiring intelligence to justify reality. It allowed being to exceed understanding without apology. What remains is not hope, not despair, not resolution. It is scale without hierarchy, time without guarantees, meaning without enforcement. A universe that does not promise to be navigable, only inhabitable. Rick stands within that universe, not as its center, but as one presence among many, capable of shaping small regions, affecting limited outcomes, and failing without cosmic acknowledgement. The curve once protected him from that condition by making his dominance inevitable. Without it, inevitability dissolves. This is not freedom in the triumphant sense. It is freedom stripped of reassurance. It is the freedom to matter sometimes and not others, to be brilliant without being central, to exist without proof. The Central Finite Curve changed reality by answering a question Rick was not ready to live with. What happens when that answer is removed is not an ending, but a beginning without direction. And for the first time, the universe does not wait to see what he will do next.